Good evening. I'm Rabbi Avram Rothman, the rabbi of the Thornhill Community Shul, of the Shul hosting this evening. And we're very glad to have you all with us to what is a very important and significant program that we hold in our shul every year, and one that is extremely important not just for us and our membership, but as you see by the attendance each year by the community at large. This evening's program consists of a number of parts, including a few speakers. We began with a procession of 6 young people, each one bringing in a candle signifying 1,000,000 Jews who passed away. And with it was what we call our Holocaust Torah, which is a Torah that was donated to us by the Taylor family, who brought it in. And that Torah is kept in our lobby all of the time as a remembrance of the Holocaust and of the things that happened during the Holocaust. And this evening each year we carry it in as a part of the procession so that people will realize a little taste of what went on. And hopefully by the end of the evening you'll have that in a number of different ways. For the beginning, we would like to be having throughout the evening, we're going to be having 6 people come up at different times throughout the evening to light a candle symbolizing different groups of people who were murdered during the Holocaust. First, we'd like to ask Mikey Laszlo to come forward, who is going to be lighting our first candle as a remembrance for all of the children who were killed throughout the Holocaust. At this time, I would like to ask that the chairman of this event, who really works throughout the entire year with coming up with ideas and various details in order to make this as interesting and as thought-provoking and meaningful as it is, I'd like to ask the chairman to come forward. That's Mr. George Friedman.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Regardless of one's affiliation in the Jewish community, it is well accepted that the Holocaust was an event of enormous and world-changing dimensions. It is almost beyond the imagination of a person to consider how the world turned so quickly and so violently against us Jews. The person who was once your friend is now your enemy. The person who was your business partner will not acknowledge you. The person you hired to clean your home is standing in your living room taking your belongings without recourse, and your neighbors, the police, or the local city official is wearing a uniform and is seeking to kill you. The world became crazy, and it became the object of its scorn. 3 million children, 6 million people altogether, numbers that are truly beyond comprehension. We boast about having a shul of 200 families, a community of 30,000, and yet these numbers are dwarfed by the reports of murder, torture, and destruction that became the norm throughout what was called the civilized Europe. The Holocaust was an unbelievable and horrible time to live. Today, we remember those days, we honor those whose life was cut short, and we look to those who survived. Our Shul has always felt it is important to take a leading role in remembering the Holocaust and honoring those who survived. Tonight will be an example of such an evening. We appreciate your attendance, and we are sure that you will find the program as moving and interesting as we found. We have planned an important program this evening, and we will hope that you will find it meaningful as we have, and thank you very much. I would like to call our Rabbi, Mrs. and Rabbi Rothman and family to light the second candle.
Take a closer one, it's okay.
For the third candle, we'd like to ask Mr. Friedman and his wife, Friedman, to come forward and light the candle.
I didn't forget you.
Good evening. I'd like to bring you up to speed on how this evening came to fruition. About 3 years ago, after Shabbat services, when the congregants of the Thornhill Community Shul scattered into the various classes before Kiddush, my father, Rabbi Beker, put out a call to action to the men's discussion group class. He asked why our community was not having any organized commemoration of the Holocaust. There are people in this community who survived the horrors, yet nothing was planned for Yom HaShoah in our shul. There was one man who was in that class, and he took the call to action seriously. And his name is George Friedman, who has become now the chairman of this evening that we have here. The next year we had an evening planned under the guidance of George and Rabbi Rothman, and this is the third year of the East Thornhill Community Shul putting on this event. This is a very special moment in time for both my father and the extended Beker family. We grew up, meeting my sister Mina and my brother Stephen and I, knowing very little about the details of my father's nightmare experience. It was too painful. Only the last couple of years has he been able to retell some of the events. Tonight marks the first time that he will do so publicly. I would like to give a brief insight into my father's life post-war, after arriving in Canada. Within a brief time of arrival, he met my mother, Cindy, and they both did something that was unimaginable at the time. It was actually scandalous. A Litvak married a Polak. Nevertheless, they went on to raise their 3 children, and my father always put an emphasis on day school education, a luxury in those days that was very financially challenging. Education has always been a priority for him, and one of his favorite institutions to support both financially and actively was the Hebrew University. For the last 57 years, my father has been active in the Toronto garment industry. He was president of the Dress Manufacturers Guild, and there was 120 shops. Today, I don't know if there's 120 employees in the whole fashion industry. He helped pave the way for more harmonious relationships between the union employees and owners. He built Beker Fashions into a highly respected company in the industry. Even today, he is at his desk every day at 7:30 in the morning. Tonight is not a time to talk about accomplishments, but I do want to leave you with one last thing. Many of you may not know that my father was a serious swimmer. So serious that in 1954 he entered the first race to cross Lake Ontario. This race garnered national and international attention. I don't know if any of you have ever dipped your toe into Lake Ontario. It is numbing cold. One person made it across the lake, and she was the first to ever do it, and her name was Marilyn Bell. My father, after many hours in the chilly water, along with large waves, cramps, and leeches stuck to his body, pulled out about the halfway mark. You can keep in mind, Lake Ontario is 32 miles north to south. Up until almost the age of 80, my father was still swimming across Lake Simcoe with his family friend, Michael Halbert. So, you know, I had a question of, like, why, I've always had this question of why did 90% of Lithuanian Jews get murdered, yet my father, he merited to be part of that 10% that survived. We cannot understand the reasons or the ways of the Almighty in this matter, but there is a concept in Yiddishkeit called yichus, meaning noble lineage. I want to tell you a quick thought or story that happened when we were at my brother Stephen and Talia's wedding in Los Angeles about 12 years ago. Stephen had just finished his Avram, and we were in the Kiddush, and my father came up to Stephen and I, and he was sort of teary-eyed, and he says, I have a story to tell you. He says, when I was a little boy, my mother used to take me to the Shul in the Kovna, where my father lived for part of his life. And in the Shul, there was a chair, this big chair, and it was roped around, this particular chair. And his mother said, this is where your great-grandfather sat. So, who was his great-grandfather? So, it was Rabbi Yitzhak Elchanan. So my brother and I guess, look at each other because I don't think either of us really knew who Rabbi Yitzhak Elchanan was. So when we got back from Los Angeles, flew back, and I came home and I did a little research, and then I really opened up my eyes. Wow, this guy was serious. Rabbi Yitzhak Elchanan was like one of the leaders of Russian Jewry for over a span of almost 40 years, and he was the rabbi's rabbi. Rabbis went to him for rulings, halakhic rulings, and he was a major figure in Jewry through the mid-1800s. And you know, when he passed away, he had like 10,000 people at his funeral. His students went to America, some of them, and they started up this yeshiva called Yeshiva Rabbi Yitzhak Elchanan, which today is YU, and there's people here who have children who are going to this well-renowned yeshiva. So my thoughts are maybe a little bit of that yichus, crept through to my father to possibly save him during the Holocaust. Anyways, so rabbis and gentlemen, without further delay, on behalf of my brother Stephen and wife Talia, and children Taiji and Shoshana, Charlie and Mina Schwartz, and children Jody, the late Carrie, Zecher Lebracha, Suzanne and Aaron, and along with great-grandchild Ethan, and my wife Carla, with children Dennis and Kelly, please join us in welcoming the patriarch of our family, Abby Beker.
Thank you for inviting me tonight. A special thank to my good friend George Friedman, who used me to share my story of survival. Only survivors can fully understand my story. The rest of you can only imagine the horrors. My name is Abby Beker. I was born in a small town in Lithuania called Yosvainai. I am a Litvak. The town had about 150 Jewish families, approximately 350 people. Life was very primitive, with no electricity or running water. The Jewish population was very close to one another, and Jewish life was centered around the synagogue. Our community was like one big family, and everybody was always there to help one another. My father was a merchant in cattle and lumber, and my mother was a very learned person. She spoke Hebrew, German, Russian, and Yiddish. Of course, coming from the Rabbi Chazzan family, she had all the ingredients. I have two sisters, an older one, Rachel, living in Toronto, and a younger sister who lives in Santa Barbara. I attended a Jewish school where I learned about Jewish studies and the Torah. When my father died in 1938, life was very difficult, but we were able to sustain ourselves. At this time, my mother decided to move to Goodman, where she and my older sister would be able to find work. In 1940, the Russians occupied Lithuania. I remember being in the street with my mother, watching the Russian army marching into Goodman. Within a month, they had closed all the Jewish schools, the Slobodka Yeshiva, and all the synagogues. We were sent to regular schools, and in the beginning of June, they sent our school to a summer camp near the German border called Palanga. We were there only 2 weeks before the war began with Germany. On June the 22nd, 1941, at 4 o'clock in the morning, we woke up to the sound of a big bombardment. Nobody knew what was going on, and everybody started to run toward Riga, Latvia, along the Baltic Sea. By noon, the Germans overtook us and marched us back to the camp. All the Jewish kids were very frightened. Okay. Thank you. All the Jewish kids were very frightened. I was determined to try and flee the camp as I listened to the Lithuanian kids talk about what the Germans had in store for us. In the middle of the night, I sneaked out from the camp. It took me 5 days and 5 nights to walk and partially hitchhike to reach Goodman, which was 240 kilometers away. I was living in barns and begging for food from the farmers. They, of course, did not know that I was Jewish. When I arrived, I fell into my mother's tearful arms. She never expected to see me again. As soon as I found out that the Jewish boys that stayed in the camp were betrayed by the non-Jewish children and were selected by the Germans and subsequently killed all the Jewish kids from the camp. The Jews of Goodman were in a state of panic. Before the Germans came into Goodman, the Lithuanians, fascists, had already murdered 10,000 Jews in Goodman. We also heard that the small town where our extended family lived were all killed. 4 years ago, I visited Lithuania and was taken to the site of the massacre. There I stood on a hillside, my aunts and uncles and cousins buried beneath me. In August, the Germans decided that all the remaining 28,000 Jews should be moved to Slobodka Ghetto, which was a very small area, primitive housing, and no running water. Life in the ghetto was hell. 3 families were settled in one room. Everybody over the age of 15 had to go to the Assembly Square and was assigned work. On October the 29th, 1941, we were woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning by the SS and their Lithuanian guards and were forced to assemble in the square for selection. 10,000 Jewish children, mothers and fathers were taken to the 9th fort and killed. The officer that ran the selection was by the name of Helmut Rauka. After the war, he lived in Toronto. He was exposed in 1980, and it took them 3 years to send him back to Germany to be tried as a war criminal. However, he died before the trial. While living in Goodman Ghetto, I was assigned to work in a rubber factory by the name of Inkaras. we were making rubber boots for the German army. I joined the underground resistance movement in the ghetto. I only knew one other person in the movement. It was important to keep our identity a secret in order to protect one another. In case we were caught, one day, so we only knew one other person. We didn't know anybody else. One day, a young woman came to me and told me about a Jewish policeman in the ghetto who was working with the Germans. The Germans came in and seized all the small children they could find. 43 children were still hidden in a bunker. And he gave away the secret. This policeman gave away the hiding place to the Germans, and they were killed immediately. We knew that we had to eliminate this policeman. 3 of us were assigned by the underground to this task. We did not know one another, nor did we question each other. We just knew what had to be done. We knew that he worked every night until midnight. We met just before his shift ended and waited for him to come out. When he came out, we jumped him and threw him in a well. At the age of 15, I carried out what I was ordered to do, but I have lived with the memory ever since. This memory has caused me nightmares which wake me up in the middle of the night. Life in the ghetto became unbearable. We had very little food. I used to sneak out in the evenings to try to bring some food for my mother and sisters. We used to go through the barbed wire. I was not afraid of getting caught because I did not appear to look Jewish, as long as I removed my yellow star from my clothes. One day I was caught in the ghetto, taken to the railway station where I was put on a cattle train. It was winter and the snow piled up on both sides of the train. They used to do it once in a while to take people, grab people from all over the ghetto and send them out. We all knew that this was a journey that we would never not return from. We moved over to the window, which was covered in barbed wire, and found a 2x4. When the train began to move, we ripped off the barbed wire and broke through the window. It was winter time, the snow was piled up on the side of the train. 9 of us jumped out from the window, only 4 of us survived. The Germans had a machine gun on the train, between the trains, they had machine guns. And as soon as we jumped through the window, they gunned down 5 of us. A bullet grazed my back. I still have a scar and reminder of that day. The 4 of us who survived went back to the ghetto. In June 1945, the Russians' front came close to Goodman. The Germans decided to liquidate the Goodman ghetto. The remaining survivors were put on cattle trains headed for Germany. The first stop was Stuttgart, where the women and children were taken off the train. That was the last time that I saw my mother. Unfortunately, it wasn't until the war that I found out that my mother had been cast in Stuttgart concentration camp. The train continued with the men to Dachau camp. The Dachau camp was the center of all the camps, had 11 satellite camps. We were assigned to camp number 1. We lived 50 people in a barrack. The barracks were just underground, and you'll see it outside. We have some pictures of that. And we lived 50 people in a barrack under horrible conditions. Hunger and disease ran rampant throughout the camp. Every night, the people who died were put outside of the door, and the corpses were collected in the morning. Every day, there was a wagon full of corpses. One incident in particular I will never forget. Starvation and disease were the main causes of death in the camps. I saw them bring in a truck full of potatoes for the kitchen, because my barrack was not far from the kitchen. And for the kitchen, they throw them down the chute. They had used to have for coal chutes, they had a chute, they threw around all the potatoes there. And the potatoes were, I noticed the potatoes was right on top. I decided that I would go and get some potatoes to eat. I sneaked out in the middle of the night, thinking that the potatoes would be right on top of the crate. This was not the case, as they had shoved the potatoes further down. I opened the cellar door, like the crate door, to get the potatoes and fell down inside. I remember began eating the raw potatoes while filling my pockets. Climbing out was another matter. It was straight, flat surface. However, somehow I managed to get out by digging my nails into the wall and using every ounce of my strength, and ended up having to empty my pockets. I could hear the Germans yelling because they could hear the noises coming from the cellar. I jumped out and ran back to my barrack and covered myself, fearing I had been caught. I came very close to death, as the day before they hung a person for stealing potatoes. In January 1945, things in the camp got very bad, and we hardly had any food. I began to lose my will to live. 50,000 inmates from all the satellite camps were assigned to work on the project building a huge underground ammunition factory near Landsberg. During this time, a German surveyor saved my life. He saw me and he motioned to me, "Kleiner, come here." And he pulled me over and took me to his hut. They had a hut and a fire going there, because it was in the middle of the winter. It was in January. It was like 20 below, and we hardly had any clothing. It was just the striped uniforms. He gave me some bread and some soup, which revived me. He kept me there for 3 weeks, helping me to regain my strength. I helped him with the surveying for the project. One day, a transport from Hungary arrived, bringing in hundreds of Hungarian Jews. We were veterans from the ghettos and more adjusted to miserable life in the camps. The Hungarian Jews died by the hundreds, as they could not cope with the conditions in the camp. One day, the German surveyor brought a young Hungarian man back with him. I asked this young man his name, and he told me he's a Rothschild from Hungary. He died 3 days later in my arms because he did not want to live. As the Allied forces began coming closer to Dachau, the Germans assembled all the inmates from the satellite camps in the principal camp in Dachau. That was on April 28, 1945. After enduring routine violence, overwork and starvation of camp life, we were forced to march out from Dachau on the 28th of April, what is now known as the Death March. When we left the Dachau camp, we were 10,000 inmates. Many people who were too weak or ill from life in the camp died along the way. Because don't forget, the march was close to 10 days. Food was scarce, and we ate anything we could find on the road. At night, they let us sleep because we were marching to the Roll Mountains, and on the side of the road, when we walked through the mountains, and the Germans made us go on top of the a little high on the mountains and to lie down for the night. At night, as they let us sleep on the mountains due to the snow and cold, many people never made it through the night. Their snow-covered bodies would lie frozen until in the morning. On May the 8th, early in the morning, I remember waking up to a rumble. As I opened my eyes, I realized that the SS guards were gone, and I saw an American tank. We could not believe that we survived the Holocaust. Of the 10,000, only 1,100 of us survived from the death march. We were taken to Munich to a camp called Artillerie-Kaserne, which was run by UNRWA, United Nations Relief Organization. A small group of Jewish Lithuanian boys, very good friends of mine, we did not want to stay in Germany. We found an American truck depot, and we decided to loan a truck. I didn't say we stole it, we just loaned it. And to take a truck and drive to Italy. We had one guy was an excellent mechanic, and he knew how to start the truck, and we siphoned up some gasoline from the other trucks, and we went over to the Tyrol Mountains. During our journey on the top of the Tyrol Mountains, the brakes of the truck failed. How we got to the bottom of the mountain alive, I will never know. I never could understand it. We managed to make it to the town of Modena. Of course, we left the truck on the bottom of the, and we walked till Modena, because it wasn't that far. Where UNRWA was helping out all of the refugees. The Italian people were very, very kind to us and helpful when we arrived. While in Modena, a representative from the Olivetti factory came and invited 5 of us to come to Ivrea. I'll explain it. Ivrea in Italian is Jews. And this is a small town. It's about 10,000 to 15,000 Italian people. Mostly, all the people worked in the Olivetti factory. There was a world brand factory making typewriters. And was located they wanted us to learn, to help out, they wanted us to learn how to service typewriters and all other kind of mechanics. We were assimilated, the Olivettis were assimilated Jewish family who were determined to help Jewish refugees. They found out that I spoke Hebrew and invited me to teach their grandchildren Hebrew. That was a special time in my life, as I was living in luxury, as they were a very wealthy family. Of course, imagine that servants coming and serving me food. In 1947, I was very happy to find out that my sister survived the war and had escaped from Stuttgart during the liquidation of the camp. By circular incident, my good friend with me also had a sister who was liberated along with my sisters in Denmark. I found out a year and a half after the war in Canada in 1948. I found out after the war, a year and a half after the war. In 1948, Canada, through the Jewish Congress, gave us visas to come to Canada. We left Genoa in March 1948 on a boat named Nia Hellas. It was a Greek boat. It was the biggest storm, it was a hurricane. Everybody was lying in, and they said, you survived the war and I have to die on the boat because everybody was sick in the bunkers. I was running around. I had a couple friends of mine that came with me. I was running around with lemons trying to help them out, because everybody was so sick. It was unbelievable. I chose Toronto because I was near Lake Ontario and I like swimming. We arrived in Toronto March the 22nd during a record snowstorm. And I couldn't believe it. I said, I came from Italy. We were playing with oranges, and I came here. And why did they send me to Siberia? Because the whole city was closed down. It was the biggest snowstorm at that time. Life in Toronto for newcomers was not easy, especially when you could not speak English. I spoke many languages, but I did not speak English. I did my best to study very hard, and eventually life became more tolerable. I was very lucky when I met my wife, Simi, and after a period of romancing, we got married in 1951. And life has been very good to us. We have 2 sons and a daughter, all married, 6 grandchildren, and 1 grandchild, great-grandchild. I had much nachas from our family. I want to thank everyone for coming here tonight, especially a couple of my friends that were in Italy with me together. We remained lifelong friends. Also here tonight is my good friend Eli Gatz, who was in the Kovna ghetto and Dachau camp with me. In conclusion, I am very grateful that I was one of the fortunate 10% of Lithuanian Jews to escape with my life. When I had the opportunity to visit Dachau with my wife Simi and our grandchildren, Kelly and Dennis, a few years ago, it gave me a small bit of gratification to see that in the end, Hitler did not win out. My legacy with my children, grandchildren who keep the continuity of Jewish values that I was raised with. I am asking the Jewish community to please make part of your children's education at home and at school the studies of the Holocaust. Let's not have to choose 6 small murdered Jewish souls to be forgotten. Thank you very much for coming.
We'd like to thank Mr. Beker for his words. We would like to ask him and Mrs. Beker if they come to light a candle.
It'll just take a second.
It's dripping down. What do you remember?
Okay.
Go on.
And just before I introduce our speaker, we'd like to ask if Mr. and Mrs. Paul Shosniak would come forward to light a candle as well. The Talmud tells us that words that come from the heart enter the heart, and I'm sure everyone joins me in saying that certainly the words of Mr. Beker were quite very much so from the heart, and we all felt it as well. I'd like to, if I could, at this point, to introduce our speaker, who is Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblum. He is the director and the spokesperson for the Jewish Media Resources. He's a widely read columnist for the Jerusalem Post domestic and international editions, and for the Hebrew daily Ma'ariv. He is also a respected commentator on Israeli politics, society, culture, and the Israeli legal system. And he speaks frequently on these topics in the United States, in Europe, and in Israel. His articles appear regularly in numerous Jewish periodicals in the United States and in Israel. Rabbi Rosenblum is the author of 7 biographies of major modern Jewish figures. He's presently working on one on the founder of Eshet Torah, Rabbi Noach Weinberg. He is a graduate of the University of Chicago and Yale Law School. Rabbi Rosenblum lives in Jerusalem with his wife and 8 children. We'd like to ask everyone if you could please give your attention to Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblum.
Yes, I don't think that there is a comparable record of human courage than the courage, both spiritual and physical, of those who survived to begin their lives again, to build up families, to build up businesses. When you think about the situation that they came without family, without most of their childhood had been taken away and their education had been gone, and they arrived on strange shores without anybody to pave the way for them to make it themselves, to build up successful businesses. I would say that Mr. Beker looks like he could still swim Lake Ontario today. It's really a story which is without parallel. The second observation, I've been going around for 2 weeks speaking on college campuses, not as many as I had hoped, but on college campuses, showing Jewish students how to refute some of the things that are said about Israel, putting them in the context of historical anti-Semitism. Of all the charges that are made, and these are regularly made in the European press, and you can hear them on North American campuses as well, is the charge that Israel is just like the Nazis, chas v'sholom, that Israel is involved in exterminationist policies and genocide against the Palestinians. Anyone who can open up their mouth and make such a charge has never read one page, heard one lecture like this, read one page of Rav Lau's biography of his survival in Buchenwald as a child of 7, has never studied a minute of the Holocaust. In point of fact, from 1967 to 1993, when Israel was in control of the West Bank, far from being a Holocaust, the life expectancy of the average Arab on the West Bank increased from 48 to 72. 50% increase in life expectancy. Infant deaths dropped from 60 to 15 per 1,000. I just want to convey to you something of the vulgarity of how heinous this crime is, how delusional these charges are. And when they're brought up today, it's only in part because people really have no concept of what the Holocaust was, and never read and never learned. And that too makes it possible to say such horrible, horrible things, immoral things. That's not my subject for tonight. I'm going to deal with an aspect of American rescue work, actually the role of the Orthodox community in rescue work during the Holocaust. In early May of 2000, there were some very shocking headlines that appeared in news outlets around the world. One of them, book blasts World War II rabbis. Another, new book slams U.S. Orthodox World War II rescue efforts. The leader in each one of these articles basically read the same. Here's the one from the AP story. During the Holocaust, ultra-Orthodox American rabbis focused on saving several hundred Talmudic scholars, ignoring the suffering of millions of other Jews who were eventually murdered by the Nazis. A new book charges. That book went on to say that they bucked the general Jewish communal framework that was equally devoted to rescue. Every word of these charges was a lie. Every word that was said was known by the person who was advancing these claims to be a lie. And the reason that this is important to me and why I think it should be important to you, because so often you will hear that Torah Jews, Orthodox Jews, don't care about other Jews. They're oblivious to their situation. If there's one clear disproof of that, it is the activities of the Orthodox community in America and around the world during the Holocaust. At least one author, David Kranzler, Oliver Sholem, brought this out in almost a dozen books of highlighting the major figures of rescue work in Europe, Jacob Griffels in Turkey, the Stormbachs in Switzerland, or Solomon Schoenfeld in England, who emptied out his house, who was the father of the Kinder transports, George Mantello, a Paraguayan diplomat who sent tens of thousands of visas that saved Jews' lives, and so forth and so on. In a book summarizing the whole topic, In Thy Brother's Blood, he points out the differences in what was the imperative that was driving Orthodox Torah Jewry. When Rabbi Aaron Cutler, who would go on to found the Lakewood Yeshiva and become the leader of the founder really of the modern yeshiva world in America, first arrived in Penn Station in New York after having come across the Soviet Union via Japan to the West Coast and then to New York in 1941, the first words that he said in his speech were "We must save Jews, we must save Jews." He made that the focus of all his efforts for the next 4 years, and not he alone, but all the community as a whole. When some criticized him for being willing to negotiate with Stephen Weiss, who was the head of the Reform movement in America, to work together with him, he said, "I would go to the Pope on my knees if it would save the fingernail of one Jewish child." Towards the end of the war, when there were ransom plans to save a train of 1,200 Jews who were in Theresienstadt, to get them out of there, and many Jews in Switzerland raised the charge these are all Jews who had been mushmadim, who had gone over to Christianity, and why were we wasting our efforts on saving them? And Rabbi Aaron's answer was, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. We have to do everything to save every single Jew. That was the attitude that characterized the rescue work in America. In 1942, when the word came from Rav Michal Ber Weissmandel in Slovakia that you could rescue, you could ransom from the government there and save Jews for $500, all the yeshivas in New York were closed. They were closed, and every Orthodox child in New York went out on the streets collecting as much money as they can. There was no parallel example in American Jewry with responding to any hope of saving Jewish children. Leaders of the community, major figures like Reb Gedalia Shor, probably the first great gadol, first great Torah giant produced in America, was Mechal Shabbos, collected money on Shabbos, filled out applications to get Rabbi Aaron Cutler at an earlier stage out of Europe, sent Mike Tress, about whom I wrote, to travel on a train on Shabbos to go through the State Department to try and find someone there who would send a telegram that might save a life. Again and again, the greatest figures, not minor figures. They didn't send somebody else to do it. They did themselves, whether it was Irving Bunam, or Baruch Kaplan, or Gedalia Shor. They themselves desecrated the Shabbos to save lives. They put nothing above the imperative of saving lives. They removed the Agudat Israel, the young Agudat Israel, Tzeri Agudat Israel, which Mike Tress was the leader, had as its motto, he who saves one soul in Israel is if he saved the whole world, and that's how they conducted themselves. The charge that I read to you at the beginning, is a debater's trick. The author of the book in question, Ephraim Zerach, knows actually that the charge is false, because he wants to focus, he claims that we can focus exclusively on one organization. What was that organization? It was called Vad Hatzalah. And it was created in 1939 for the purpose of saving Torah scholars in Europe. That Vad Hatzalah was only one small fraction of Orthodox rescue work, a small part of it. They tried to get these scholars out on what was called a special visa, emergency visa. You had to show that you were above the quota, you had a person of distinction. Now, these weren't used just for Torah scholars. They weren't taking away any other Jews' chance to get out because they required special criteria. About 40 Torah scholars got out on that basis, and they became the builders of everything that has flowered in America since. there were 2,000 other Jews, artists, writers, who were brought out by other Jewish groups, 2,000. And yet we don't find that Zurov is busy accusing them of having shown concern only for artists and writers, for great speakers and Zionist leaders. There's no such accusation. Only with respect to these 40 Torah scholars does he raise this charge. So it's a debater's trick, but it's a debater's trick for another reason. It's only a small fraction. The same people who headed Vadat Tzala, Rav Aaron Cutler, Rav Avram Kalmanovich, Mike Tress, Rav Eliezer Silver, the very same people were involved in every aspect of rescue work. The leading organization, which was getting visas for desperate Jews in Europe, which was sending applications to Jews who needed consular approval in Europe to apply for visas, was Sarei Agudas Yisrael. This was hundreds of youthful volunteers who were filling out these long forms, 6 feet long, without even the benefit of more than a manual typewriter, long before. Today it might appear rather easy. Then it was very hard, without copy machines, in quadruplicate. Girls working through the night over and over again. Mike Tress went to Washington every single week to plead with the State Department when there was a denial of such an application. And he was successful in about 25% of the cases. The youth, the 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds went around from door to door to strangers, begging for affidavits of financial support. If you couldn't prove that you had adequate financial support upon coming to America, you couldn't get consular approval. You couldn't get a visa approved. And they were dedicated to this work. This was what they were devoted to. At a later stage in the rescue activities after the creation in 1944 of the War Rescue Board, one of the figures, the leading figure, War Rescue Board was an organization created by the American government to advance plans for rescue, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the leading non-Jews who was working on this board, they were basically all from the Treasury Department under Henry Morgenthau, the most prominent Jew in the administration. He said, if we don't agree to this, he writes to the Secretary Morgenthau, if we don't agree to this, the rabbis are going to tear the town down. They will tear the town down. They were not apathetic. They were the most vociferous and irrepressible and determined group within American Jewry to reverse the general apathy. There were things that the Orthodox did that no other group would do. In 1939, the British declared a boycott on sending any food or anything of monetary value into the areas which were already under Nazi control. That meant into Poland, which was already under Nazi control. No Jewish group in America violated that boycott, except one. Agudat Yisrael of America, Sarei Agudat Yisrael of America. Because they said those food packages being sent to Krakow and to Poland and to other cities in Warsaw, those could be the difference between life and death for the Jews trapped there. And whatever the British said, they would fight against the British to break that boycott in order to save Jews with the food packages that could be sent. Other groups would not use diplomatic pouches, which allowed information to be gotten from Europe, and that's subject to U.S. government supervision. It was illegal. The Orthodox did it because they needed to know what was going on in Europe. Other groups would not transfer money, would not make money transfers to Europe or to engage in ransom discussions with the Nazis or their sympathizers in the countries under Nazi control. The Orthodox did it because for them, everything, the transcendent principle was he who saves one Jew. The transcendent principle was Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh L'Zeh. Every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. The saving of a single life, the single fingernail of a Jewish life was the imperative that they advanced. And the most amazing thing, as I mentioned, they bought fake Latin American passports. They knew they were fake, but they were used, if they could be smuggled to Jews under Nazi control. Many times the Nazis would honor those passports if they were held by a foreign national and spare them from the worst the worst of the camps. Sometimes they saved about 10,000 Jews that way. No other group would traffic in what they called false passports. That didn't bother the Orthodox because it was saving Jewish lives. They were willing. Reches Sternbach traveled in the middle of the war from Switzerland into Germany with a Swiss fascist. He was a fascist. He was a Nazi sympathizer at the beginning of the war. But she went to negotiate with Himmler, Yamach Shemo, because it might save a Jewish life, delay the deportations. Maybe they could bargain with the Nazis who wanted to save their heads. And they did delay deportations. They delayed them, and Jewish lives were saved. They were denounced. They were denounced by the head of the Joint Distribution Committee in Switzerland, Sally Meyer, by Nathan Schwab, the leader of the Swiss Jewish community. They were denounced for having trafficked with the Nazis. But for them, it didn't matter, because you had to save a Jewish life. That was the only thing that mattered. How would we save Jewish lives? And the most amazing thing about this is the first charge that was raised. Zuroff himself, the author, the person who was behind all these stories, because they were identical stories in hundreds of media outlets around the world. In the aftermath to his own book on the Vad Hatzalah, what does he write? What does he say about the Vad Hatzalah? The Vad's most lasting legacy to the Jewish people was its dedication to the saving of Jewish lives. And he credits a group of foreign-born, not-English-speaking rabbis, Rabbi Avram Kalmanovitz, Rabbi Lazer Silver, Rabbi Aaron Cutler, with having led the efforts to unite American Jewry around rescue work. The rabbis referred to were, of course, the same ones accused in the sensational news stories. And what about the charge? What about the charge that they had departed from general communal auspices, that they had operated on their own and broken down communal unity? Again, exactly the opposite. Raoul Hilberg, the author of The Destruction of European Jewry, describes the condition, the general attitude of American Jewry: total paralysis. Total paralysis. David Weinman and the abandonment of the Jews, they couldn't get beyond the business as usual attitude. And this is something that we all have to remember, because we are faced today with similar challenges. When 2% of American Jewry says that Israel or Iran will be the primary issue in the coming election, don't we see the same apathy today? Aren't 6 million Jews today under threat of annihilation by potential annihilation by a nuclear Iran? How could somebody say, I have something more important to worry about? 98% say there's something more important to worry about. If you would go into the Orthodox community and ask what are the comparable figures, it would be 80% would say this is the most important issue. Jewish lives are at stake, and it's again at stake. These are not just historical lessons. These are current realities, not historical lessons. Far from being united, far from being able to get beyond their own narrow interest, these groups acted. In fact, the leading Zionist groups acted to harm the rescue work. There was one group that led the rescue efforts in America. They weren't Orthodox, though the leader of them, Peter Bergson, whose real name was Hillel Kook, was the nephew of Rabbi Yitzhak Avram Kook, the chief rabbi of Israel. And he was a revisionist, Jabotinsky follower, but when he came to America, he realized that the purposes that he had come for, to create a Jewish army to fight Hitler, was no longer the major thing, and he worked to arouse American Jewry to rescue. He found almost no allies. Far from finding allies, he found sworn enemies. This group, the Bergsonites, created a pageant using some of the leading Hollywood stars of the time: Edward G. Robinson, Paul Muni. I don't want to date myself. I even remember some of these were. 60,000 people saw this pageant, We Will Never Die, to arouse American Jews and non-Jews to the plight of Jews in Europe. And yet, after 6 showings, 60,000 people, the most powerful expression in public relations, when the New York Times would only put stories of the Holocaust on page 18, this pageant was run in Madison Square Garden, but it was stopped after 6 showings around the country because the groups that hated the revisionists wanted it stopped. They were afraid that they would become too powerful. For other Zionist groups threatened sponsors if they would continue with the groups. It was stopped. In August 28 of 1942, Stephen Wise, the most powerful Jew in America, received a telegram. The telegram was from Gerhard Reigner, the head of the World Jewish Congress, and he described a plan to destroy European Jewry. What did Wise do? Nothing. He sent the telegram to the State Department for confirmation. He did nothing. On September 3rd, 5 or 6 days later, Jacob Rosenheim, the head of World Aguda, received a similar telegram from the Sternbachs in Switzerland. And what did he do? He raised a hue and a cry, forcing Weiss to call a meeting of all the major Jewish groups on September 6th. But at that meeting, Weiss accused the rabbis of spreading atrocity tales. He never mentioned that he had received the telegram from Reigner, and he disbanded the group at that point. A month later, at a meeting of all major American Jewish organizations, rescue was not on the agenda. Only a post-Holocaust state in Palestine. A year later, a full year after this telegram to Stephen Weiss, at a conference again of all American Jewish organizations, the entire debate revolved around Abba Hillel Silver's resolution for a post-Holocaust Jewish state in Palestine. Rescue again was relegated to a minor or non-existent point on the agenda, and only the Jewish Labor Committee and the Orthodox groups were pushing for its inclusion at all. When the Bergsonites pushed forth in Congress a rescue resolution, so Weiss and the mainstream of American Jewry opposed it for two reasons. First of all, their love of Franklin D. Roosevelt was so great they feared that this might create controversy and hurt Roosevelt's re-election campaign. But more importantly, they feared that it would strengthen the Bergsonite, the revisionist. And they fought tooth and nail. The only allies that the Bergsonites found in this, the only allies that they found were the rabbis. There was a march 2 days before Yom Kippur in October of 1943 of 400 rabbis on Washington. They couldn't get the president to meet with them. They couldn't even. He pretended that he had to go to a nearby Air Force base to meet with some Yugoslavian airmen. It wasn't important enough for the president to meet with them. They were relegated to a brief discussion in the anteroom of the White House with the First Lady. And then they introduced this rescue resolution in Congress, and the major mainstream Zionist groups fought against it. They attached to it what they knew would be a rider which would make its passage more difficult. A passage committing the United States government to the support of a Jewish state in Palestine, which mixing the two issues together. But this resolution did scare the administration. It resulted in the creation of the War Rescue Board, which was largely a product of non-Jewish officials in the Treasury under Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who had been completely changed by his meeting with Rabbi Avram Kalmanovitz. As he wrote in his diary, the rabbi wept and wept and wept. He turned an assimilated German Jew into a fighter for the Jewish people with his tears. And the non-Jews and Jews in this group became the primary agents of rescue that there was, about which David Weinman, a non-Jew, estimates in the abandonment of the Jews that the creation of the War Rescue Board resulted in the saving of between 100,000 and 200,000 Jewish lives. If only it had come about before. If only there had been pressure on the American administration to do more for rescue. If only the plans that were being hatched by Orthodox Jews in Europe, Rav Weizmandel, Yaakov Griffel, all the rescue plans, the Sternbach's plans had been financed. And even after the formation of the War Rescue Board, it was the Orthodox who were pushing one scheme after another, fighting against the mainstream organizations and against the joint in Switzerland to get the money that was necessary for these ransom negotiations to go forward. What was the unity of the Jewish community? One non-Jewish figure in the WRB wrote to Morgenthau, "I'm afraid that Peter Bergson, the head of the Bergsonites, will be assassinated. I think that they will kill him." He wrote to Morgenthau, "Every Jewish organization is more interested in their fight with some other organization than they are with the objective of saving Jews." Could there be a more damning criticism from a non-Jew in his experience that they were more interested in every other intra-Zionist fight than they were with the saving of the Jews? And Bergson himself, he wrote later, there was only one group that fought with him, that stood with him. Who was that? The Orthodox rabbis. They were more courageous. They were simply more responsive, more Jewish in a sense. They were more sensitive to the issue and less affected by the environment. They operated on the old Jewish theological concept of he who saves one soul saves the whole world. This is not a pretty story. You read the rage in Wyman's book, A Non-Jew. The abandonment of the Jews is primarily about the abandonment of the Jews by the Western world and the American government and the British government. But it is also a striking cry against the abandonment of the Jews by our fellows, for those who did not feel the imperative, who did not understand that at Sinai we became a people. We need every single Jew, and every Jew is infinitely valuable. As Rabbi Cutler put it, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Is infinitely valuable. And that's the attitude upon which these rabbinic leaders who allied themselves with the Bergsonites, who fought with them, who became their sole allies in the American Jewish community, were motivated by. A Jew is a Jew. Every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. The value of every Jewish life, he who saves one soul. And these lessons are not lessons that we can allow to disappear from us today. They're lessons that we have to hold dear. Because once again, we find ourselves threatened. Jews are under threat today. They're under threat in Europe. They're certainly under threat in Israel. We face major, major dangers. And we have to be, I'm not arguing that we face something on the parallel of the Holocaust. I don't want to be a scaremonger here. I'm not trying to be a scaremonger. But there are real dangers. There are real dangers. And it's one thing that we learned from the Holocaust when our enemies say, as Hitler wrote so explicitly in 1933 with the publication of Mein Kampf, when our enemies say that they mean to wipe out, to exterminate, to extricate the cancer of the Jews from the world, take them seriously. The world has no right to once again ignore that and say, oh, they're really rational people. Oh, they really couldn't mean that. Nobody could really mean that. They could mean it. And if we don't learn the lessons of this section, this part of our history, we will once again have failed. We've criticized our elders before. Jewish youth growing up with me in the 60s and 70s wondered how did American Jewry not be doing more. They were poor. They were afraid of anti-Semitism in the country. They had very little social standing. We don't even have those excuses today. We don't have those excuses today. We don't have the Christian hatred that existed then. It's quite the opposite. We have social standing. We have people of prominence. We have no excuses. And if we don't wake ourselves up, then we will be doubly guilty of having forgotten one of the crucial lessons of the Holocaust. Thank you.
We'd like to ask if Dr. and Mrs. Taylor could come forward to light one additional candle.
And as they're about to do that, I'm asking Harry Goodman if he would come up and following the light of his candle. Harry will be reciting the Camel Yerachamim, the memorial prayer for the 6 million.
This time I'd like to ask if everyone could please rise as Harry recites the Kalmali Rachamim for the 6 million who perished during the Holocaust.
Kalmali Rachamim Shochein B'Meromim Hametzei Menucha Nechona Anakanefei Hashechiyena B'manos Kedoshim Dorim Kezohar Arakia Mazirim Esenishemos HaKadoshim V'Hatoarim She'amusu V'Shenergu V'Nishtaktu V'Nishrefu V'Shenibiyuhu V'Shenechnegu Hakiyetush Hashem Hayidei Aserorim Hagmadiyim Yemav Shema V'Sicharam Mavo Shebeline Deretei Tzedakah Miyad Askara Nishmateyem Meganein Eliyem Nechasam Lachein Beyav Valarachamim Yasireyem Seiseg Navav Liyahoy Elohimim V'Yisror Mitzror Achayim Esrit Moshe V'Yem Adinoi Hunachalastam V'Yanoa B'Shalom Mishkevoseyem V'Noi Maor V'Noi Maor Amen.
You may be seated. This time I'd like to ask Mr. Friedman to come forward and to close this part of our program.
On behalf of our Shul, we would like to thank everyone for attending and participating in tonight's very special and moving program. We pray that the messages you have heard will leave an impression and assist us all in recognizing the total destruction of European Jewry and on an individual basis the pain that so many were forced to endure. Would like to thank Mr. Rabbi Beker for sharing his experiences as a survivor of this terrible time. As well, we want to thank Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblum for his insightful word and Harry Goodman his recitation of the memorial prayer that was so moving for all of us. Irving Fink for his assistance with the special candle holder and everyone else who participating in making this the fitting memorial it is. We would also like to thank the Taylor family for the Holocaust Torah that sits all year in our lobby and remind us all year round of the Holocaust. This Torah, specifically donated in memory of the Holocaust, represents the memory of the past and is a catalyst for the future. In closing, please allow me to invite each of you to join us in the Shul's library for a reception. Before closing, I do want to recognize and thank the sponsors of tonight's event. The sponsors are the Taylor family, Mr. and Mrs. Abby Beker, and my wife Ira and myself. Thank you all very much for joining us, and I wish you all a good evening.